Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Is your organization prepared to keep up with the future? Today, Kris Ostergaard will help us find out. Kris, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Kris, you've written a book, Transforming Legacy Organizations. So I think the first thing we have to find out is, how do you define a legacy organization? What does that mean?
Yeah, so a legacy organization basically just means companies, organizations that have a certain age, typically also a certain size. They've been around for longer time, very often many decades, sometimes even hundreds of years. And that means they have a lot of legacy, they have a lot of history, a lot of baggage, and that impacts significantly how they go about the world, how they view the world, and how they also conduct innovation.
So basically companies that we would know or recognize their name, or stores that have been around that we do business with.
Absolutely.
Now, there's also a term that you bring in there. It's kind of cute. You mentioned unicorns. What is a unicorn in this in this setting? I'm sure it's not what we usually picture it.
No. So unicorns used to be these mythical creatures, right? What happened about probably 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, was that people in Silicon Valley started to use that terminology around the startups that become really, really successful and scale at a really rapid pace. And initially, they called them unicorns, well, because, going from a zero to becoming $1 billion company, which is what is the definition of a unicorn company, it used to take 20 years, but now we see, I believe, research I've found says that the fastest unicorn, the fastest startup to go from first dollar investment to $1 billion valuation, it took them 236 days. So we see this massive acceleration in how new startups can grow really big, really, really fast, and that's a big challenge for the established companies. So
in less than a year, I think, if I heard your numbers correctly, this company became $1 billion company that you were referring to. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I think I want to be a unicorn. That's my new goal in life.
Everybody does, yeah.
We're talking today in your book about innovation, and you say it's more difficult in established organizations, but it's also more likely to succeed. Can you tell us why that's so?
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of the paradox is that, the established companies talk a lot about these unicorns and are, scared of them and their immense innovation power. And the paradox here is that really it doesn't need to be like that, because innovation, on the one hand, yes, it's much more difficult for the legacy company, the large established companies, simply because their systems are much more complex. They're much bigger. They have many, many offerings. They have very complicated processes internally. But on the other hand, no one really has a better chance of succeeding, because what the established company has that the startup doesn't have for a very long time is, all the resources, being a customers, data, money, infrastructure, talent, etc., etc. So what it really points to is that it's much more about mindset, and it's much more about the design of how they go about innovation than all the other stuff.
Now, Kris, when we're talking about an innovation in your book, for instance, if it's a company that makes shaving products, is an innovation taking a shaving cream from just your basic type of fluffy soap and making it menthol or peppermint or, smelling cute? Or is innovation the shaving company that is now making tires or aftershave products or cosmetics, something different? How would you define innovation?
Yeah, so one of my motivations for writing this book was actually the fact that innovation is a very thick word. It's a term that is widely used, but most often very not very well defined. And so what I spent some time on researching and exploring to really get to the bottom of was, innovation basically is bringing something new to the world and materializing it. That can be customer-facing, but it can also be internally in organizations, innovative new processes, for instance. But what I talk a lot about in the book here is that it's very helpful for the established companies, the legacy companies, to think about innovation in a way where they need to understand that they actually need to innovate in multiple tracks at the same time. And the innovations that I'm talking about are significantly different from each other, and there are different design principles on how to be successful in it. And sort of one of the examples that you mentioned here with the shaving cream, and it can have scents, etc., that would be what I would call an optimizing innovation. That is what the established companies are world champions at. They do that all the time. It's when the razor manufacturer, makes you a TV ad and say, now we don't have 3 blades, now we have 4 blades, right? So that's an optimization of the existing. That happens all the time, that as it should. It's important to continuously try to optimize the existing. But what is very important for the established companies is that they need to understand this is not enough, because inherently what they're doing when they do optimizing innovations is that they are improving upon the past. So it's only for the short term. So they also need to prepare for the future, and they need to ultimately invent the future. And that's why they also need to conduct augmenting innovations, which is where they upgrade the core of who they are. So this is where we see companies going from analog to digital, or starting to apply artificial intelligence to their existing value offerings, for instance, which creates many, many opportunities and can potentially create much more customer value. And finally, they need to do mutating innovation. And that is where they challenge their existing core and where they conduct radical experiments on who they might be on the long term, 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
So, Kris, if I heard you correctly, and I just want to reiterate for our audience, there's basically 3 tracks that companies should follow: optimizing, augmenting, and mutating. Did I get it correctly?
Exactly.
Okay, I'm doing good. If you're a college professor and you gave me a test, I'd get that question right. So if a company
you
is...
get an A.
I get an A. All right. I didn't get too many in school, but now I'm getting them. But so we want to optimize, augment, and mutate and get that lined up. Kris, we want to find out more about transforming legacy organizations, but at this point in the show, we'd just like to remind our audience that if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Today, our guest is Kris Ostergaard, and he is the author of Transforming Legacy Organizations. And Kris, can you tell us your website and where we can get the book?
Absolutely. So the book is available on Amazon. Easy to find, Transforming Legacy Organizations. My website may be a little harder to find because I have this weird Scandinavian last name, but it's krisostergaard.com, and Ostergaard is spelled Oestergaard.
And Kris, we will give that information to our audience again later in the show. So if you're out there, if you have a business and you're saying, gee, this is something that applies to my business, or we're just thinking about this, I'd like to get more information, I'd like to go to Kris's website, all that information we will give you. Just get your writing instruments ready, and this will come up again as we go on in our episode tonight. Now, Kris, you mentioned that an organization must understand its immune, IMMUNE. We think of an immune system, something to do with medical products or in the medical world. So in an organization, what is an immune system, and why is it important to understand that?
Yeah. So immune systems are inherently about the barriers towards innovation in organizations. And the metaphor of the immune system has been popular in Silicon Valley for a number of years, where I spend a lot of my time. I'm actually just here right now, or flying out after having been a part of the Singularity University Global Summit, which is where we explore all the future technologies and where we're heading in the world. And the thing about the immune system is, the immune system in the human body protects the body. But sometimes it's actually not beneficial for the body. The example is if your body needs a new organ, and we experience that the body actually rejects the organ. So that's the metaphor to think about when you're an organization. You have an immune system that protects the organization from dangers from the outside. But because the world is changing so rapidly due to technological developments, there's so many more threats, so many more opportunities out there. But used to be protective for the organization tends to not necessarily be that any longer. And what then happens, and it's a little bit complicated here, is that in fact there's not just one immune system. There are really 3 layers to the immune system, because typically what happens when companies are not successful with their innovations is that there is a lot of finger pointing going on. It's top management pointing at middle management saying they don't want to innovate, and middle management points to the employees, and the employees, they point back up at high up in the chain of command. But the fact is that, yes, of course, there's human resistance to change. That is a real thing. But there really is both an individual immune system, there's also an organizational immune system, and there's also a societal immune system. And companies, organizations need to understand that in order to remove the barriers for future innovation and remain or become even more successful for the future.
Now, Kris, when a company has its culture, it grows up around there. And if I'm right about thinking about a company's culture, it's like the things in our own home. We have a certain way of doing it. It might be dinner at 6 o'clock. It might be lights out at 10 o'clock, or all work, literary type work is done in the basement or up in the library, wherever. Does a company need someone like you to come in, an outside consultant or an expert, to kind of recognize these problems with the culture? Because they're so imbued with it, the people who work there, and I don't mean this as bad or positive, but it's just part of what they do every day. They might not even recognize it. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, so in many ways, we all become blind to a lot of things in our everyday environments, right? We sort of filter it out, it's like if you repaint your house and there's this little spot that you forget for whatever reason, and then you tell yourself, I got to remember to paint that spot as well, right? But 2 weeks later, you don't even see it any longer. You've forgotten that it's there. And so when we tend to, we get used to the way that things run, and particularly if we're successful, and that's another one of the paradoxes here, that the need for really thinking about innovating for the future is also important for the companies that are currently successful. But when we are successful, we also tend to become complacent, and we sort of settle, and we are comfortable, and we get these what I call status quo cultures, right? So we are most comfortable with the existing, and sometimes you need the outside push to become aware. Sometimes it can come from the inside, but there's certainly something that needs to push you to become aware of, hey, is this what is going on? And do we actually need to challenge our status quo cultures? And most large, older, established companies, they need to do that. They need to transform their cultures to become much more innovative than what they currently are.
Do they give you a hard time and basically say, the expression we tend to rely on, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're doing well. Everything's fine this year. And I guess we all want to see the world as rosy. So we think everybody's always going to want our product as it is. And of course, we know that we have to innovate and things change. Do you get that as a problem a lot with companies?
Well, that's certainly a standard problem, if you like. But to be fair, more and more companies realize now, due to all the stuff that they see going on outside the corporate doors in terms of new companies, the unicorns we spoke of earlier, in terms of new technological opportunities. Now you can't open a newspaper without reading about artificial intelligence and robotics and autonomous vehicles and blockchain technologies and all of that stuff that is really remarkable. How big a focus there is in any type of media on that stuff compared to just 3-4 years ago when we also worked a lot with this stuff, but it was much more unknown to people. So most established companies have a certain awareness around that there's a lot going on. What they don't necessarily have awareness around is how to act upon it, how to react, how important it is, how urgent it is, and what's the strategy to move forward.
And that's why we need your book, Transforming Legacy Organizations. Kris, at this point in the show, we want to take a brief break and let our listeners know that you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Our guest today is Kris Ostergaard. He is the author of Transforming Legacy Organizations. I'm your host, Bill Horan, and we'll be right back after this brief break.
Adopt US Kids presents What to Expect When You're Expecting. A teenager. Learning the lingo.
Today I'm going to help parents translate teen slang. Now, when a teen says something is on fleek, it's exactly like saying, that's rad. It simply means that something is awesome or cool. Another one is totes. It's exactly like saying, totally, just shorter. As in, I totes love going to the mall with Becca. Another word you might hear is jelly. Jelly is a shorter, better way to say jealous. As in, Chloe, I am like so jelly of your unicorn phone case.
You don't have to speak teen to be a perfect parent. Thousands of teens in foster care will think you're, rad, just the same. To learn more, visit adoptuskids.org. A public service announcement brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, and today our guest is Kris Ostergaard. He is the author of Transforming Legacy Organizations. And Kris, I have to mention something that you mentioned in your book, and I think our audience will love this. You say you love thin books, right?
That's right.
And I mention that because your book is a little over 200 pages. It's well spaced out, so if someone is looking to transform their organization, this is not a difficult read. This is something they could pick up and read in an evening, really, if they want to go through it, or if they want to space it out a little bit, a few days. But it's nothing that's going to pressure them too much, and yet it can save them tons of problems and lots of money in the real world. Now, I think part one begins with the heading, Sharpen the Axe. What does that mean? Does that mean you have to start firing people?
No, Sharpening the Axe really points to a quote that Abraham Lincoln is at least credited for, where he says, if I had 6 hours to cut down a tree, I would spend 4 hours sharpening the axe. So what that means is be prepared and do your research. And too often, this is a real problem. Not just in college, but also in business life, is that we are so focused on creating results and getting to success so fast that we actually skip the important parts of doing our research, of figuring out what the right questions are to ask, and really do the analysis in the proper way. And that also means, again, because of the massive changes that we're experiencing in society, powered by all of this technological development, is that there are even some of the old traditional questions any organization has been asking themselves for many, many years that they need to re-examine. So just for instance, which industry they are in, or who their customers and competitors really are. And I'll give you an example of how to investigate this, because in the book I use the example of a fun little game you can play that we call 6 Degrees of Competition, to sort of explore your competitive landscape. Now, so the idea here is that, whatever value offering that you have, and as a company, you can have many different ones. In the book, just to keep it simple, I use coffee. Now, so what is, 400 grams of ground coffee from Folgers, for instance, just to pick a really well-known brand. What is the first degree of competition? What's the second, all the way out to the 6th degree of competition? And then how can you tie the knot back to the 400 grams of coffee here? Now, so first degree of competition, pretty obvious, any other brand that also sells, 400 grams of ground coffee in the supermarket. There are literally hundreds of them. Second degree of competition could be tea. If you drink tea, you don't drink coffee. Third degree might be Red Bull or Coca-Cola. It's cold, it's not hot, but it's loaded with caffeine, so in many ways it provides the same value. Fourth degree might be Starbucks. You go to Starbucks to buy coffee, you don't brew it at home. But once you get beyond sort of the third and fourth degrees, things become more tricky and more difficult to examine here in terms of who your competitors might be. And so in terms of coffee here, when I get to the 5th degree of competition, what I was thinking about, and use an example in the book here, is that the meditation device, the Muse. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Muse, but it's a meditation device that you put on your forehead and behind your ears. And what it does is that it reads your brainwaves. So it can read whether your brain is in beta, alpha, or theta state, meaning how focused you are, which is sort of some of the same values that you very often also look for in coffee. And when you use the meditation device, you also have on headphones, because there's an app that provides you with soundscapes. You can hear the beach or the jungle where there's a lot of noise and a lot of wind, and the closer you sort of get to the theta state, which is where you want to go, the less noise and less wind you hear. Now, so the point is, this is gamified meditation in a convenient way. And the point here is that when thinking about a product like this, what's the relationship to coffee? Well, I can't help but think what a meditation device like the Muse might do to coffee cup number 3, 4, 5, or 6 during the day. Late in the afternoon, you're tired, you still need to study, or you still need to be at work and be focused. So will you drink that extra coffee, or might you use your meditation device for 7 minutes? And finally, there's the 6th degree of competition. Excuse me. Where I push it even further out and say, let's 5-10 years down the road, a bunch of us may actually be able, most likely, to take autonomous vehicles to work and no longer have to drive. So what will that mean when we no longer need to go to gas stations where most coffee brands sell 40% of the product?
That's a real interesting point you made, because I never thought of sitting there. I mean, and in fact, I was going to say, gee, that's pretty far out, thinking about the competition and the 5th and 6th degree. But that's okay. You've made some excellent points. Just that a business has to think: where is it going to be sold next? Where will it be? What will be our next convenience stop? And it also kind of makes you stretch your mind a little bit. And I just find that very interesting. And I think for any business, just that alone, if you sit there and analyze your 6 degrees of competition, boy, you may come up with something that just opens up a whole world of business opportunities. Kris, before we go further on our show, I'd like to remind our audience that if you're listening to this station, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Today we're talking to Kris Ostergaard, and he is the author of the book, Transforming Legacy Organizations. Kris, we're going to ask you where the book is available and if there's a website you want to tell us about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is available on Amazon, so it's easy to find, Transforming Legacy Organizations. And if you go to my personal website, krisostergaard.com, you can read much more about it and also read the first chapter for free.
Sounds like a good deal. And if our listeners are paying attention, this can be a great opportunity. And again, Kris likes thin books, so it's not going to require you to read too much if you get involved with Kris's book. Kris, you say we go by some rules of thumb, and these are often wrong. So can you tell us what these rules of thumb that most of us kind of are guided by, and why are they wrong?
Yeah. So really, the human brain is really old school technology developed for a world thousands of years ago, and on the savannah in Africa and the jungle in Africa. And that also means that the human brain is actually equipped with a lot of biases that may have been really smart back then, but not necessarily are that smart any longer. Now, some of these biases are really important for innovation. One of them is the status quo bias, which means that we would rather not lose than win. So we are more afraid of losing than we are anxious to win. So that holds us back. We also have what is called the omission bias, which means that human beings in general are prone to inaction rather than action, because that is also about taking risk. Excuse me. And we also all have what is called the sunk cost fallacy, which means that once we've invested a lot of time, energy, also money into something, then we tend to insist on actually pursuing it very often much longer than what is healthy. That is one of the reasons why we see many companies continue to put a lot of money into processes and products that no longer work.
You know, that's very interesting, because I guess we all like what we're doing currently. We avoid change, and we don't want to make our lives too different because it's going to make us think a little more. And we'll say, well, you know, gee, this is fine. What's wrong with the product as it is today, or the business as it's running? And again, it may be adequate for today, but will it be prepared for 2-3 years down the road? And if we don't start that now, where will we be at that time? there's something called Moore's Law mentioned in your book. Can you tell us about that and why it's important?
So Moore's Law is in many ways the foundation for all the technological development that we're experiencing, because Moore's Law points to the development in computational power, named after Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel. And what he discovered more than 50 years ago was that the number of transistors they could put into computer chips doubled approximately every 18 months, meaning that the computer power they were able to provide doubled every 18 months. And that has actually been true for 50 years. That is the foundation for the digitization of our societies and our companies.
So every 18 months things are doubling, is that it?
Yeah, that has been true. I mean, it's true with some modifications, but ultimately what it means is that the price performance doubles. So how much bang you get for your bucks, if you like, has been doubling for more than 50 years. That's why, you can now buy smartphones down to $10, $20 in some parts of the world that used to, be as big as a house and cost millions and millions of dollars.
Kris, you mentioned that it's important to have a narrative. What does that mean?
It means that human beings, we're all driven by stories. And stories are the way that we make sense in the world. We know that from sitting around the fire at camp, or telling bedtime stories to children, or watching movies and listening to the radio. So that also means that if we have a strong story around the purpose of companies and the jobs that we're doing, that is very, very powerful motivator for us as employees and also as customers.
Kris, what message would you like to leave us with? If someone is considering making a change in their organization, give us a quick 10-second piece of advice that we should listen to.
Yeah, you need to understand that your employees and your coworkers are remarkably adaptable to change if they have the right circumstances to do it. So be sure that the organization is actually designed to let your people thrive.
Kris, we want to thank you for being with us today. We want to remind our audience that they've been listening to Kris Ostergaard. He is the author of Transforming Legacy Organizations. If you're thinking of doing it, and if you're not thinking of transforming your organization or innovating, your competition probably is, so you're falling behind the switch a little bit. Be ready for it. Get hold of the book, Transforming Legacy Organizations, by our guest today. We'd like to remind our audience that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.